Welcome back, my fellow assassins, to another episode of the Dark Assassins Podcast, the show that dives deep into not just technology, but the concepts, software, and procedures behind it all, and explains it so simply that even your grandma can understand it. As always, I'm your host, the Dark Assassin. So, I guess to start off this video, I gotta make a confession to you guys. I have been seriously spoiled. And what do I mean by that? So, recently, I decided that I would take up a project of trying to write a game or demo or basically do some kind of program writing for the Game Boy Advance. So, the reason I say that I've been spoiled is I've had the luxury of being able to program for devices that have an operating system and actually have system calls you can use and have APIs that you can call and have graphics drivers you can utilize and basically have everything that makes your life as a programmer really, really easy, relatively speaking, of course. So the reason why this is a big deal is because the Game Boy Advance doesn't have an operating system, for one. So there's no, system calls you can use. You can't say, like when you're writing a program for, your regular desktop, let's say, you can call something like cout if you're using C++, you can call printf if you're using C, print if you're using Python, system.out.println if you're using Java, etc., and it'll write something to the console. Well, since that's using a system call in order to do that. But since the Game Boy Advance doesn't have any system calls like that, those don't exist. So you have to write it yourself. And there's some things you can do, like you can call specific hardware related things. Like if you want to reset the device, you can do a specific memory loading in assembly, which is way down, super low level. And you can do it that way to do some system calls, but some basic stuff that you take for granted in most programming languages just does not exist. And graphics is an even worse fare. I know I mentioned in the first episode of the Dark Assassins podcast that graphics is 100% witchcraft. I don't understand how it works. And, I really don't know how to understand how it works. I get the idea of how it works. It's just, the way you go about doing it and making sure things are where you want on the screen and that kind of thing is kind of a pain. But you take it a step further, where you can't just, call a simple, draw square or something, or draw line or draw rec or load image or anything like that. That doesn't exist because there's nothing to load. There's no graphics library or API. You're out of luck. You got to do it the old-fashioned way. You basically have so how it works is you have to so I guess to go back a step, if you want to say display an image, you first have to convert that image into code, essentially. So basically you have to break down the image to the point where it's basically just a bunch of hexadecimal numbers that relate to you can think of it as a tile or a pixel and colors, and you break it down into these super small pieces kind of a thing, and you stick it into a program file, a header file or something that the code can read just as a string of numbers, essentially. And then you have to take those numbers and load them into specific memory addresses so that the hardware will go to read from those memory addresses and display what you want on the screen. Does that sound complicated? Because it kind of is. I'm not even going to try to sugarcoat it. If you're someone that works specifically on low-level systems or embedded systems, or write, operating system level programs or that kind of thing. Like, this probably sounds like a cakewalk to you. You're like, okay, so what's the big deal here? But for us normal folk that write, higher level programs and aren't, super down in this low level stuff, this is definitely a change of pace. So I'm used to, having APIs and graphics libraries and that kind of thing that basically allow me to make calls that do all this memory stuff in the background for me, so I don't have to think about it or worry about it. So basically, rather than trying to have this image that has been converted into just a bunch of numbers, and then trying to load it into specific memory addresses and not overwrite things and making sure everything is, lined up right, and I didn't write too much memory in there and overflow stuff or anything like that. All that's just done for me. I can just call something like load image with an API call, and then it just magically all does that for me. Obviously, it's not magic because, as I've kind of discussed here, it's doing the whole process of loading things into memory. It's just doing all that for you, so you don't really have to think about it, which is the really nice thing about APIs in general, that they can take a lot of the headache out of it for you, and libraries and all that kind of thing. They take all the headache of trying to figure out, okay, how do I actually do this, and do it all for you, so you don't have to worry about it. So yeah, I have been severely spoiled because let me tell you, this little side project that I've been trying to work on with the Game Boy Advance, it's been kicking my butt for sure, and it's not just been kicking my butt; it has kicked my butt to the curb with the trash, and then that wasn't enough for it. So then after it kicked my butt to the curb with the trash, it then decided to roll me over with a steamroller. So yeah, it's been pretty rough, but it's definitely a good learning experience. Kind of learn kind of the behind the scenes stuff of how these systems work, especially the Game Boy Advance, since that was like the main console I grew up with, grew up playing, lots of hours poured into that thing. Mostly Pokemon games, but I had some other games too. There was a Hot Wheels game and a Finding Nemo game that I had. It was a good time, a lot of good memories. So it's definitely a fun project. Trying to, well, it's not fun when it doesn't work, but when it does work and do what I want it to do, it's definitely fun. Especially since recently I bought basically a card that allows me to put ROMs, which are read-only memory. It's what it's called. And basically that's just like the game data for specific games for the Game Boy Advance. So I bought a card that allows me to load ROMs onto an SD card and then put it into my Game Boy. And be able to basically play games on it, so I don't have to switch out a bunch of different cartridges. Although, in my opinion, nothing beats playing from the actual cartridge. But the nice thing about this is I can if I really want to, rather than testing my code in an emulator, which basically is pretending basically at my desktop running what would be like basically not even the operating system, the system of the Game Boy, so it acts like the Game Boy and everything like that, mainly so I can do testing, so I don't have to constantly write my ROM to an micro SD card and pop it in my my Game Boy. But it is definitely cool that I have that option to be able to do that. So it's definitely nice. And then another thing I did was I ordered an actual rip-off Game Boy card, or a Game Boy cartridge from China. It was 25 cents shipped. We'll see if it actually shows up and is actually legit. But my thinking was I know it's not even it's gonna be like a rip-off game. It's not even gonna be like a legit game. So I have another tool that allows me to write directly to Game Boy cartridges. So I can read and write save data from them. So I can literally just take whatever is on that, wipe it, put on what I want on there, and be good to go. And use that as my quote unquote legit cartridge for the game / project I'm working on with the Game Boy. But yeah, it's a fun project. Hopefully, I'll be able to learn more about it and actually get decent at it, because it's pretty overwhelming, if I'm being completely honest. Since I even going through school, I was never all that great at like the super low level stuff, like hardware level, like manipulating with like memory addresses and that kind of thing. That was never really my strong suit. So it's definitely taking me outside my comfort level and getting me to grow as a software developer, which is definitely key, which is an actual perfect segue into the main topic of today's podcast. So today we are going to be talking about personal projects in general, kind of, why they're important and that kind of thing. So now, I don't want to toot my own horn, but one thing that I have noticed in like various job interviews and that kind of thing is I always have people commenting on how impressed they are at, the fact that I have done so many personal projects, like outside of, work and school, and like kind of the variety of them, because apparently, according to them, most people, if they have any projects listed, it's just like, school projects they worked on, and, that's not necessarily as impressive. So if you're listening out there and you are trying to get a job in software development, the number one thing I can recommend is do personal projects. They don't have to necessarily be super overly complex, but, find something that's interesting to you and make a project about it. It could be something like I'm doing, take a old hardware like a Game Boy Advance and write a program for it. If you're wanting to do like some low-level embedded systems, operating system stuff, if you can show that you can, write a Game Boy Advance game, that'll definitely take you places. If you want to do something like if you want to be a web developer, if you don't have your own website, first off, what the heck are you doing if you want to be a web developer? Why don't you have a website if you want to be a web developer? I mean, that's kind of like step number one. If I was going to be hiring for a web developer and you didn't have a personal website, bye. So yeah, like that's another kind of project you could do. A lot of the personal projects I come up with are just kind of things I kind of find a need for, or find something that I would find interesting. One of the projects I've done was what called the Snapchat database. Basically, if any of you listening aren't familiar, Snapchat's a social media platform, and it's known for basically once you send a message, it's gone. So unlike, texting or something where you can see what you said to the person when they respond, unless you specifically are typing in the chat part and save the message or have it set to be saved for 24 hours, the message is gone. So you kind of have to remember what you were saying, which I think actually back when I made the program, I don't even know if that saving after 24 hours was even a thing yet, if I'm being honest. But, regardless, the whole point of it was that after you sent the message, like, it was gone and you wouldn't be able to see it. So for the main point of Snapchat, I guess that's a good thing. I guess I should say for the original intent of Snapchat. It's obviously evolved since then. But so that is one of the appeals, that the messages just disappear. But the problem is, if you're like me and like most of my friends, you tend to forget what you said, especially if there's a semi-large gap between times of when you sent the message and when the person responded to you. So, heck, even like I'll send something and then like I'll be actively doing something and my mind will just be off, the topic. and then they'll respond and like with like 15 minutes, and I'll check and I'll be like, I have no idea what I just said. So basically the point of the Snapchat database was to be able to like basically just keep track of your conversations for you, since I thought it would be something useful. So I made a desktop application for it in Java, and then I also made a iOS application using Swift, which that was actually one of the reasons why I guess one of the reasons why I ported it to the iPhone, because originally I just wrote it as a desktop application. I just wrote it in Java since it was super, I won't say easy, but I mean, it wasn't too difficult. It's basically just, dealing with strings. That's basically it. You have string for the person's name and, the conversation you had, what you said to them, and then a basic thing to kind of look up by the name. So it wasn't all that difficult. But the reason why I wanted to port it to the iPhone was I wanted to get more experience, dealing with iOS development and dealing with Swift. Since that was a programming language I've never really dealt with before, and I've always been interested in iOS development, but I never really got into it, mainly because I didn't really have, much point in, like, I didn't really have any kind of app, to develop in mind, I guess you could say. So I was like, I got this Snapchat database for the desktop. Wouldn't it be cool if I had a mobile app for it too? But I guess the other reason why I never really got into developing iOS apps is, for whatever reason, I kind of understand, but at the same time, like, come on, Apple. To be able to put apps on the App Store, you have to be an Apple developer and have a developer's license, which costs $100 a year, and your boy ain't paying for that. If I had, if I made enough money off, if I knew I would make money off the app, which I wouldn't, because I'd just make it free and wouldn't put ads in it, because people that put ads in their apps are, gosh, have you seen mobile games? I mean, those things are just crawling with ads, and it's terrible. Which is why you should totally get Pi-hole. Not sponsored or anything, but Pi-hole is awesome. It can basically get rid of most of those. Pi-hole, for those that aren't familiar, is basically a DNS server or a domain name server. So basically what it does is, when you want to go to, say, since we're talking about Apple here, if you want to go to apple.com, your computer doesn't know what apple.com is. So what it has to do is it has to make a DNS request to basically look up and say, hey, where is apple.com on the internet? And then it'll go to a DNS server, and the DNS server will find an IP address, which is basically like, think of the IP address as like the home address of apple.com, for example, on the internet. And then the DNS server will send that back to your computer, and then you'll, go connect to apple.com. So what Pi-hole does is it basically serves that same function, but it can have a block list of known, like, advertisement sites and known ads. And if you're trying to resolve a domain name that is in that block list, it'll just block it from, getting to you, so you don't have to see the ads, which is really nice. The only downside is YouTube and Google are super dumb and annoying, along with some other platforms, but specifically YouTube. I hate them. So basically what they've done is I guess you could say, caught on or whatever. So rather than sending ads from a different domain name, they send the ads and the videos from the same domain name. So you can't just block the domain name with a basic DNS blocker, which is kind of a bummer. So it doesn't block that, but it is what it is. It blocks most ads. It also blocks a lot of trackers. So a lot of companies and whatnot will put trackers on their site to try to gather more data on you and kind of follow you around the web, and Pi-hole does a pretty good job of blocking those also. So it's pretty good for your privacy too. Obviously, it's not a silver bullet. Privacy is done in layers. there's no one tool out there that's gonna keep you super 100% private. But it's definitely a good step. So back to the topic at hand, I guess. Apple developer. Yeah. So if I knew I would be making money from apps that I developed, then sure, I would put the money down to get the Apple developer license and pay the $100 a year. But I know I'm not going to do that, so I don't really feel like I wouldn't say waste $100, but kind of waste $100. Because I mean, the main benefit I would get is I wouldn't have to constantly re-sign the app to my phone when I wanted to use it. So for those that aren't familiar with how iOS development works, when you write an application for an iPhone or an iPad or whatever, you can, as the developer, you have a 7-day certificate that you can sign to the application. So basically what that means is when you write an application, you can put it on your phone and it's valid for 7 days. The main reason why they did this was basically so you can test it out in the wild, and it would kind of be really dumb on their part if you needed the $100 developer license to even be able to put anything on the iPhone. But yeah, so you don't have to have the developer license to be able to write iOS apps. You just need the developer license to be able to put them on the App Store. So that's kind of one thing that's prevented me from that, and having ideas are really the two things that have prevented me from getting more into iOS development. But it's definitely something that intrigues me, and I'm glad I did it. It's definitely a really good learning experience. Something that I guess you could say throw on the resume, although I didn't do it for the resume. I did it because it was something that was interesting to me. Which is really, I guess, another thing about personal projects is you can do it for, not only you can do it for your own pure enjoyment, but you can also do it to, stay on top of technology. You can do it to build your resume. I mean, there's a lot of, you can do it to fill your free time. I mean, there's a lot of upsides to writing your own personal projects. It's just a matter of finding something that's interesting to you and doing it. But the reason why personal projects are so important is because I don't know about any of you if you've gone through college or not, but boy, are there a bunch of idiots in college. Degrees mean nothing, I tell you. I mean, I guess it depends on the field, but as far as computer science is concerned, I don't care if you have a degree. The degree means nothing. You can have a degree in computer science and be a complete idiot. I went to school with some people that, honestly, I don't know how they graduated with the degree. I really don't. So there were some people in a 300 level computer science class, which, if you're not familiar with how college works, basically 300 level classes are mostly for juniors. And if you're going to be in a 300 level class, you're either majoring in that subject or you're getting a minor in that subject. So basically you're devoting a lot of time to this subject and you should have a pretty decent understanding of it. And there were people in my 300 level class that were asking what a for loop was. Yes, they were asking what a for loop was. Now, if this was, a 100 level class, I could understand that. 200 level, it's a stretch, but sure, I could understand that. A 300 level class, you don't know what a for loop is. Are you serious? Imagine you're trying to learn. So say you're me. Obviously I speak English. I understand things about my language, and that would be like me trying to take, French and being like, What's a sentence? How do I make a sentence? I mean, my guy, it's the same thing as English. It's just structured different. I mean, that's literally it. Like, if you're in a 300 level computer science class, you've obviously had to do some kind of programming to get to that point. So theoretically, you should know at least the basic concepts of how to program. One would think anyway. Now I know, depending on the school, I guess the amount of programming you do could be varied, and obviously there's a lot of kids in college that copy and paste their way to greatness, copy and paste their way to, I don't even know if I could say success, because most of them don't even get that good of grades anyway that do that. But they're just idiots, man. I mean, now on the flip side though, there were some people that, like, they were complete whizzes, let me tell you. Like, they did some stuff that, wow. Like, one of my friends that I went to school with, DOS Dude 1, he is something, let me tell you. I'm not sure, any of you that are familiar with, like, the Mac modding community probably know of him, but he managed to write multiple patchers that made unsupported Macs able to run the latest version of Mac OS. So off the top of my head, I know he wrote one for, I believe, Sierra, High Sierra, Mojave, and Catalina. He wrote patchers for, so unsupported Macs would be able to run those versions of Mac OS, which, like, mind-blowing. I mean, this kid, he was in college and maybe even high school, to be honest, but, like, college-age kid, doing this stuff. Like, what? Like, so you have the extremes in college, it's especially in the computer science world. You have the complete idiots that you're wondering how the heck they're about to graduate when they don't even understand basic programming concepts. And then you have the other people, like, that are, like, you don't even need this degree. Like, you're already doing stuff that's, like, that, like, senior developers at companies, like, are doing. Like, what? So it really depends. And that's really how you can tell the people that do personal projects and those that just do projects for school, and that's it. And that's the real takeaway, is the ones that only do projects for school, they're generally the ones that don't necessarily do the best and have trouble finding jobs. The ones that do the personal projects and are, living, breathing, programming, those are the ones that excel and become, the big boys. Like, if you think about it, like, Bill Gates and, like, Mark Zuckerberg, they pretty much, the reason why they were successful was because of personal projects, right? Like, they dropped out of school based on, the success of their personal projects. Like, that's what we're talking about here. Like, now, I'm not saying you're not going to write a personal project and expect to become, the next Bill Gates or Mark Zuckerberg or Jack Dorsey or the next big CEO of some company. Like, that's probably not going to happen realistically. But, like, that's what we're talking about here. Like, the idea of being able to grow your understanding and learn and just kind of build on your skills is really, it's not only beneficial to you, but it's also attractive to, potential employers or potential collaborators, or something that basically tells people that would be interested in either having you work for them or working with you or for you, that you know what you're doing. Like, I've seen some people's GitHubs, specifically that I went to school with, that is literally, I would say, at least probably 95%, if not more, projects from school. Which, don't get me wrong, I have on my GitHub some projects that I did in school, but over half of them, probably the majority of them, are just personal projects I've done. And that's only a fraction of the personal projects I've even done. Those are just the ones I thought were decent enough to put on GitHub, or that were in a more complete enough state, I guess you could say, that I felt they'd be, good enough for the public to view. Like, for example, the Game Boy Advance development I've been doing, that's not on my GitHub because that code is kind of trash. I guess it's not trash, but it's not great. It's not in a good state where I'd be happy to show this off to someone and be like, look, this is what I've done, kind of a thing. And I have I have other projects like that too on private repos that I don't expose to the public, mainly because they're either not that great or they're still like in early stages of development. And I don't want everyone seeing that kind of thing. Eventually, there are some of the projects that I do have private, I will plan on making public, once I get further along in the development process. But, it is what it is. Like, for example, one of the projects I'm working on, kind of in combination with the Game Boy Advance game, is I'm trying to essentially write my own Pokemon game from scratch. And that's definitely not on my GitHub. Mainly because that project's really in the infant stages. I have a decent amount of work done on it, but it's still, in infant stages. And, yeah, but so the main goal, I guess, there was I thought it would be cool, which is, basically how, personal projects come up, right? I thought something would be cool, so I decided to do it. I thought it'd be cool to try to, make it, add another platform to it and have, a Pokemon game that I wrote be able to run on a Game Boy, which is where I played my first Pokemon game, which personally I thought would be pretty cool. I guess we'll see if it ever happens. I am kind of at the point where it's not a sure thing. Like, I'm not saying it's going to happen. It's just kind of a thing that I think would be cool if I could get it to happen. But yeah, I get back on the topic of personal projects and whatnot. Not only do they help you get jobs, but they can also help you with your current job too. Like the job that I do, for example, the Pokemon game that I'm developing, I'm writing it in C and C++, and the Game Boy development I'm doing, that's mostly in C at the moment. And most of the development I would do for my job has been in C++. So, and the thing with C++ is, honestly, I never really liked C++. Like, in college, I was not a fan. And I don't know, I guess it was the class structure that I was in. I just didn't like it. But yeah, now that I'm working on a personal project with it, I love it. It's great. I have done like a full complete 180 on my opinion of C++. And that's another thing about personal projects too, is not only can you, completely like learn a new skill or enhance your skills in certain programming languages or topics like, networking or something like that, but you could also discover that you actually like something. Like, you might have, had a terrible professor or a terrible teacher in, a certain language, and then you decided just for the heck of it, you'd do your own personal project in that language, and you decide over the course of working on it and learning about it that you really like it. That was 100% my experience with C++. I didn't like the language. I thought it was annoying that you had to, manually do all this stuff with memory and pointers and all this stuff. Since I came from Java as my first programming language, and Java has this idea of garbage collection, which is essentially all the memory handling and memory cleanup is done for you, so you don't have to worry about it. So basically how it works is, if the program notices you haven't used, say, a certain variable or something in a long time or whatever, it'll just put that memory, reallocate it back to the stack or the heap or wherever it came from. So other, variables or data structures or whatever can be able to use it. But in C and C++, that doesn't exist. If you don't free your memory, it ain't getting freed until you close that program, which can be problematic, especially if you're running a server or something that basically has 100% uptime. If you have what they call memory leaks like that, where you don't free your pointers and free your memory that you're not using anymore, you're gonna run into some issues, which I never was really a fan of. But now that I've kind of taken on this project of writing my own Pokemon game and that kind of thing, I realized just the sheer power that these pointers have, and just having access to memory. It's just so powerful, and honestly makes my life so much easier. Like, I tried to write my own quote-unquote operating system in Java that basically ran on top of a current operating system, and I thought that was like the coolest thing ever. But looking back on it, that code was terrible. Like, Java was such a bad choice. Like, C++ would have been such a much better choice. Although, in credit to it being written in Java, Java actually has a graphics library, which C++ doesn't. Which is kind of, I guess, one major downside of C++. If you want to do anything that isn't like 100% command line based, you're going to have to learn or utilize some third-party graphics library, because C++ doesn't have one, which is, I guess, kind of a bummer. But like, I don't know how graphics libraries are kind of finicky. Most of the time, if people use graphics, they're using third-party graphics libraries anyway. Most people aren't using baked-in ones to the language unless they're just going for something super basic, which I guess kind of makes sense. Since if you think about it, most built-in graphics libraries have to work across multiple platforms and be lightweight enough that it can be built into the language. Whereas you could have, specific libraries for certain platforms, like third-party ones that can be a lot more extravagant and a lot bigger. And so trying to build a really, really solid graphics library into a programming language is kind of overly ambitious, I would say. But, it is what it is. That is one downside, I guess, of C++. But the main reason why C++ still probably would have been the better option was because I could just deal directly with memory. I wouldn't have to... Because basically how I'd solve the solution was just create a bunch of new windows every time you went to a different screen, and essentially wrote the ID of the user to a file, and then just read from that file every single time, which from a security perspective is absolutely horrendous. I mean, if you were a hacker trying to break this thing, if you knew what ID number the admin was, you could just write that number in that file, and boom, you're off to the races. You can just completely destroy the system. So yeah, in hindsight, it was pretty bad, at least from a security perspective. But it was, it was still like a pretty cool project to work on nonetheless. But yeah, the thing is the thing with personal projects is it can allow you to either grow in your understanding of things that you already know, just kind of build on your skills and improve them. You can learn new skills. If you've never used a programming language before, doing a personal project in that language is a great way to learn it. If you want to use a system you've never used before, like for me, trying to write a game for the Game Boy, never done it before, great learning experience, even though it's, like I said, kicking my butt to the curb and running me over with the steamroller. It's still good learning experience. Or if you want to, learn new technologies to stay on top of things, like you want to, for example, you want to write, like a Docker container to stay on top with, what the industry's doing or something like that, great. It's definitely, personal projects are by far in my opinion, aside from actual work experience, the best thing that you can do as a software developer if you want to not only improve your skills, number one, but have a better chance of not only getting a job, but getting a higher paid job, and moving up the ranks a lot quicker, in various companies. Because even if you are working at a certain company, and you do personal projects, who knows, maybe you'll be doing a personal project working with Ansible and Docker containers, let's say, and then your company is like, hey, we have maybe they have a new position, or they want to try to incorporate that kind of stuff into your current workflow, and you're like, hey, I did a personal project on this. I've worked with this before. I know how to do this. And that'll instantly elevate yourself amongst your company, give you a raise, although, money's not necessarily everything, but that is definitely a driving factor for a lot of people. But it'll definitely make you a lot more competitive in the workplace. And it's honestly just a lot of fun, like maybe it's just because I'm a geek and a nerd that I, do programming in my free time rather than, some other things that other people do. Like I don't really, go out necessarily, for me, rather than going out to a bar or a club or whatever, I'll just sit in my front of my computer and click-clack away on my keyboard writing a personal project, which, I kind of think if you're listening to this podcast, you're kind of probably also more, I wouldn't say you're like me, but you're probably kind of also, maybe more secluded, more introverted, that kind of thing, and, kind of like doing your own thing. But, personal projects, if you've never done one before, highly encourage you to do so. Honestly, if you've never even programmed before, I would still encourage you to, find a language or find something that's interesting to you, and, write your own script, write your own program, do something. It's a great way to learn. It's a great way to, better understand your technology. Especially if you're, working on, like an operating system or working with networking or anything like this, it really makes you have to understand how the technology works. Like you can't write, a program that interfaces with networking stuff without understanding how networks work. You can't write an operating system without understanding how hardware works. It's these kind of things that it really makes you have a better understanding of how these technologies work, and is definitely a fantastic learning experience. So I think that's going to do it for this episode of the Dark Assassins podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, I please ask you to leave a rating and a review, and subscribe if you haven't done so already. Share with a friend or family member that you think will enjoy hearing about personal projects and my spoiledness that I talked about in the beginning, and how I got my butt completely handed to me by the Game Boy Advance, which is 20-year-old hardware. Yeah. So if you have a question, or leave it in a rating and review, or you can email me your questions at contact@darkassassinsinc.com, and they might end up in a future episode of the Dark Assassins podcast. You can also click the link in the show notes below to send me that email as well. And that's going to do it for me in this episode of the Dark Assassins podcast. Until next time, my fellow assassins, remember, bool nothing equals true. If action not equal to null, return true. I'll see you next time on the Dark Assassins podcast.